Hello, my name is William James. I'm the host of the Board Book Geek. How are all of you? This video is kind of an interesting one, but before we get going, I have memberships and Patreon available, so feel free to join. So, let's talk about the latest Lord of the Rings news. New Lord of the Rings rights owners tease future projects. New IP holders of everything Lord of the Rings has some serious plans. Oh, Mother of God. This is my thing. I have no issues with adaptation. I say this with complete hand on my heart. I mean, the Peter Jackson movies are a prime example of a good adaptation. But what I find interesting about this news is the new IP holders want to create and get more stuff done. So, with the reasonable failure that is Rings of Power, I think it's all just left a bitter taste in a lot of people's mouths. The new CEO won't go into specifics, but he has been consulting with other film companies and business partners, and the best way to develop, as he describes, a world-leading fantasy IP. Well, maybe I have some hope in the sense of, and I mean this, in the sense that as long as the Tolkien estate are involved and people are directly involved with the problem, and I do find it funny that, you know, with the Rings of Power and everything that's happened, and people have pointed out, review bombing, 38% audience score is not review bombing. It's a problem. And even if Rings of Power had not had a Lord of the Rings IP attached to it, I would be saying exactly the same stuff. It was very much an objectively bad show with cringy dialogue and horrible characters. And that's ultimately the thing that happened. They created a Frankenstein's monster where Peter Jackson adapted the work and made it fit for screen, and some changes I like, some I don't, but it's very much the Lord of the Rings. Rings of Power completely rewrote it to the point that the Lord of the Rings can't happen at this point. I mean, I think ultimately, I feel like we have to be careful milking franchises. And ultimately, I don't want this to become Star Wars. And that's the big concern. Although I think one of the interesting things about this whole Rings of Power debacle is that the whole situation is that you're going to have different companies making different things, different IPs based within the one IP. And that's going to cause some very interesting hiccups, especially commercially, because they're going to be competing. And I find it interesting that ultimately the whole situation of this show could have been avoided. And the fact that this article literally starts with the success of Rings of Power, Amazon's Rings of Power, I mean, seriously, this article isn't rooted in fact or popular opinion. I hope, and genuinely I hope, we don't end up with a situation where where we end up with, like, The Mandalorian but in Middle-earth, or Obi-Wan in Middle-earth. They're gonna milk it, and that's my big concern as someone that loves The Lord of the Rings, loves the world and loves Tolkien, and loves Peter Jackson. My concern is that it's just gonna be, it's gonna be bad. And I say this, the Rings of Power reminded me of the Shannara Chronicles, but with some mildly better CGI, and I will give credit where credit's due, the scenery was stunning. But that's all I can say. I've never watched an objectively bad TV show and gone, what the hell are you doing? I feel like they could have done something so epic and big and done something that respected the fans, respected the lore, but instead you have actors, producers, directors attacking the people that should be watching your product. And I think even if this show had been the best thing since sliced bread, the fans still would have reacted the same because you are insulting us. Now, the gaslighting amongst the Rings of Power fans is funny. There was one quote someone said to me on Twitter that someone came after him and said, well, the Peter Jackson movies saved Lord of the Rings. The books were going out of publishing, out of print and all of this because they weren't selling anymore. Like, books that have basically outsold, in terms of fiction, have outsold the Bible. They weren't going out of print in the early 2000s or late 90s. That, again, the gaslighting is ridiculous, and that obnoxious little troll on Twitter who basically gets a hard-on just insulting people is also gaslighting as well, which is very toxic behaviour, but Twitter doesn't seem to want to do anything about his account. But my big concern is this is just going to become another dead horse that's flogged to death until it can't do anything else, and it becomes a cosmic joke. In terms of writing, in terms of everything that's happening with the Game of Thrones prequel, that's absolutely fantastic. Brilliant show. And no, the criticism of Rings of Power is not to do with the race of the actors, it's not to do with representational diversity, it is to do with the sheer crappiness overall. So I just wonder how they're going to do this. And I take this stuff with a pinch of salt because ultimately it's a news article. There is a video game coming, which is going to be about Gollum, which I find really strange. It looks kind of pretty. We'll see what they do with it. And I feel like if you're going to do a non-canon Tolkien story, look at the Mordor games. I think they did it really well. Was it a bit cheesy? But they did a non-canon story. They intentionally said from the start, we're not interrupting Tolkien's canon, we're creating our own thing. And I think I would have had a little bit more respect for Rings of Power if they hadn't have basically lied. So, tell me what you think about this news. I don't think we need any more Lord of the Rings properties. I think we just need those books and those glorious Peter Jackson movies and leave it at that. Because at the end of the day, if Rings of Power is anything to go by, this will turn beautiful work into a cosmic joke, i.e. Star Wars.